Hello and welcome to Unsourced Wall. My name is Elvis, and as always, I'm your host. It's going to be kind of a packed episode this week. We have a lot of reviews and also the return of Titans Season 2, so we're going to be getting right on into that in the later half. But first, let's start with some movie news. Alright, the only thing we have of any interest to talk about is that apparently Sony has come out and said definitively that the door is closed on any negotiations or any kind of reconfiguration of their deal with Disney. So that is pretty much over. And I have to say, I can't wait to see what they do next. I'm excited. And I really hope that this is for the best because I just hated Far From Home so much. So fingers crossed, and hopefully, we get something interesting or something at least unique out of it. The only other thing in movie news is that the teaser trailer for Birds of Prey came out. It was leaked online, and it's pretty much nothing but a bunch of quick cuts from the characters, and it's only like 30 seconds long, so it's not really interesting at all. Although it does seem a little bit less low budget as hell than I was expecting. It actually looks like it has some production value, so 2 thumbs up. I can't wait to see an actual full-length trailer of it. It's really hard to gauge anything out of it, so fingers crossed, and at least it looks like an actual movie. And well, there's really nothing interesting to talk about, or at least anything that much to talk about in terms of TV news or comic news. I think the only thing in terms of TV news that I could comment on is that we have leaked images from the What If series that the MCU is doing for Disney Plus, and it looks boring as hell because they're confining themselves completely to the MCU, so we're not getting anything like out there or ridiculous like what if Ben Grimm was the Punisher but also the Silver Surfer. Instead, we're just getting what if character was this, and it has to be the characters from the MCU, so all 12 of them get to be one other thing, and that is just boring as hell, and it's really restrictive of them to waste potential of a series like that. But other than that, there's absolutely nothing else to talk about, so let's move on ahead to what I read this week. First things first, we have the Green Lantern number 11. This is the penultimate issue of the first season of this series, and I have to say, it's kind of letting down all that came before it. What worked about those first issues, what really worked, is that they were substantial and compact, really needling in and focusing on the job and ramifications of being a Green Lantern, the range and expectations of having that sort of position, a setup that Morrison was doing wonders with by having Hal as the centerpiece of it all. And while I've been enjoying most of the series since then, it's really here where I realized that it's kind of come a really far distance from that, and it's just not as interesting. It's just not as solid, and each issue is less and less satisfying. It's become the sort of book I was worried about when it was first announced. Just that same old wacky BS from Morrison that I've come to expect and get bored and annoyed with. Non-stop big ideas, but not as much emotional and character-driven stakes, payoff, engagement, or grounding. I remember the bare bones of what happened in this issue, but I would be hard-pressed to tell you why or for what end. It's going to really need to make a solid landing with the next issue in its finale, because right now, I'm just starting to gloss over and really just nod off reading these. The art from Liam Sharp is still solid, the vistas and concepts are there, just not anything else, and that's a shame. Overall, 1 thumb down, 1 thumb middle. Next up, we have The Dreaming number 13, and this is a series that I was already starting to gloss over on, because The Dreaming is something that has been losing me again and again, which is something that I would have been more adamant about with the previous issue had I reviewed it, but it was just so out there and so messy that I just didn't want to at all, because that was honestly the kind of issue that makes the Green Lantern number 11 look simple and streamlined. This issue, number 13, on the other hand, is actually an honest to God, really nice, effective, and hard-hitting character piece, which is great. I have no problems with these types of issues when they're handled well, and this one is handled excellently. But in view of the broader picture, it's just irksome that we have a main plot that is so fragmented and coming apart at the seams that Spurrier is taking the time out for an issue like this. It's just really wasteful. I would rather have more issues trying to deal with and make sense of the insanity than ones like these. Because while it's honestly engaging and enrapturing, what sort of series will we be left with when this eventually ends? I would rather have a story that is worth going back to, and I hope this series finds a way to do that. Fine issue, it's well done, but I want more for this series. I want to see it stand the test of time because it reaches heights that make that potential, but it's just not capitalizing on it. It's honestly just kind of ruining itself with its overwrought, trying to be wannabe cleverness, and it is just such a disappointment. This issue, however, great character work, great drama, and some really soul-crushing, but also rather enlightening character studies. So, well, I enjoyed it. And so overall, 1 thumb up, 1 thumb middle. Moving ahead, we have the Immortal Hulk number 23, and this was a pretty by the numbers issue. I really don't know what else there is to say about it. I wish there was more to talk about, but it's just another point A to point B issue. It's a style of Immortal Hulk issue that I've really grown to hate. Not that it's bad, but that it feels so unsubstantial in the face of everything else around it. We finally have a face-off with the Hulk, his crew, and Shadow Base. And all that really happens is a few punches being thrown in a fight and Rick going off somewhere with the reporter. There's really not enough within it to count as either actual build-up or more depthy character work, which this series can do fantastically either way, and it's just aggravating to have to wait while wading through more of this standard filler. Because the series has done and does do a lot more than this. It's the stopping and starting of a run being punctuated by issues like this that really get me uptight. Not a terrible issue, but it's more of a nothing of one. There's one great beat with the Hulk and the reporter, with her realizing just how far he's gone and how far he's come in his destruction, from being almost like a child lashing out to something even more dangerous than she could ever imagine. But after that, it's just an action scene and just some legwork to do. I'm still excited to see what comes next, but I have a feeling that number 25 will be to make it or break it for me with this series. And so I hope it gets there, and I hope it finally makes itself come out as this really cohesive whole. I just want that to be that. It's very similar to The Dreaming, but in like the opposite direction. And well, fingers crossed. This was a readable issue, but that's all I was able to do with it. Read it. I didn't engage or relate to it or really immerse with it at all. 2 thumbs middle. And for our next to last review, we have Doomsday Clock number 11. And I just have a few things to say. This entire series could have been done in 4 issues. The first 3, number 10, and presumably, hopefully, number 12. But with how this penultimate issue ended up, even that is in question. The only thing I really engaged with in this issue was this overbearing tone of despair. And that's not on the reader, but of Jeff Johns' 2DC. While I have no doubt that it's been a bed of his own making, there's just something so pleading about this issue in relation to everything that he probably wanted it to be. From the world of DC itself collapsing, to subplots and foundations that he's been working on for like years now, like Saturn Girl, being literally phased out. It just comes off as Johns making a final swan song for his era of DC. It doesn't make the issue good, but it does make it a little bit more tragic. All the more so because of how useless it is. And how most of the series has been. All we get here is some more long-winded explanations of Ozymandias' plan that didn't need any elaboration, and more trite, overused, and ridiculous match cuts and irony-laden puns. It would almost be filler if it weren't so close to the endgame here. Any real enjoyment to be had out of this issue is purely tangential, like figuring out that Lex was hiding in the bushes when Barry and Wally reunited, or that Lex has been tracking Dr. Manhattan through time, or that Dan Dreiberg was punching Julie's son. All neat stuff. Sometimes pretty hilarious, but all are afterthoughts when they could have been the substance that made up an actually entertaining story. I don't know what the future holds for DC, Jeff Johns, or Doomsday Clock, but if this issue was any indication, it veers toward the negative, and it is just really depressing. It really is. Overall, 1 thumb down, 1 thumb middle. And finally, we reach Legion of Superheroes Millennium number 1. And well, let's see. If Doomsday Clock is the swan song of the Johns era at DC, then Millennium is another sign that the Bendis era is taking hold. And it is genuinely awful. Like, I cannot believe how bad this was at what it was trying to accomplish. It's nothing more than just another ego-stroking exercise for Bendis. A lazy, cynical way of making his mark with the most bare-bones attempts at fan service. It's just a montage of events, all the while counting on brownie points from fans who don't really care for anything outside of what they know and whether or not it's being used. Like, hey, it worked for his Young Justice, so why not here? It's a story that starts with no cohesion, no tethers, no themes, and no real rhyme or reason, other than just being a greatest hits playlist of his own definitive version of the DC timeline. And it does it so cheaply. There's no actual, thorough line into why any of this is happening, why it's happening in this way, and there's really no immersion or engagement because it doesn't want to have any. It's just scene after scene of, hey, remember this, hey, remember this, hey, remember this, while using some third-rate character with the least amount of characterization to just, follow through it all. And it is just the most blandest waste of time. It's so dull, which is ridiculous because this is the kind of premise that has been done with DC multiple times before, in very little pages even, and yet this is an issue that can't even reach that level of actually telling a story or a narrative. For a two-part prologue that is meant to funnel through time to show the impact of the Legion and how everything led to them, it doesn't do that at all. In fact, it crumbles. It's a mess. And overall, it is just honestly the weakest way of trying to build hype or anticipation or excitement for this team that I have ever seen. Alright? And it is honestly surprising that Bendis outdid himself in this regard, because I had no hopes and he really shot past them. Overall, 2 thumbs down. And so we're heading on into what I watched this week. We're back with the first episode of Titan Season 2, titled Trigon. And well, this is pretty much what would have been, or what should have been, the finale to Season 1. And you know what? It would have been a pretty solid finale. Even without the reshoots, which comprise most of the climax, like the last 20 minutes, what we have here is something that would have done a better job of landing the character arcs and themes of the first season pretty solidly. Of course, it's also really janky and goofy at doing it, but it would have had enough closure to beef up whatever cliffhanger they wanted to do. So it just feels like an awkward start to a season when it's all about things that the audience have had a year's time to forget about or just stop caring about. It's running on a momentum that no longer exists. All the stuff that happened in Season 1 that you should have some lingering, emotional tether to. But if you do remember it, it works. If you don't, then it's kind of nonsensical. And it tries to bring it all back around. And I like that in a finale. There's some odd stuff, sure, like how all the other characters fall to temptation in like a second when it took Dick an entire episode. Or that a huge part of the climax relies heavily on that really off-putting Beast Boy Raven ship hinting. Plus the acting and writing of the actual resolution being very flat. But really what works for me is that it still wraps things up pretty cleanly. And I honestly don't know where they could have taken it next. They cut through to the core of the first season. What made it work, what characters were at the centerpiece, and really what set everything in motion emotionally and in terms of the character dynamics and the arcs. And that helps keep it afloat. And I enjoyed that. Moving past that, the stuff that is set up for this new season actually seems pretty fun. We have Jason again, who I immediately remembered being one of the highlights of Season 1, and he is a highlight of this episode as well, and with what is looking to be a decent Deathstroke in Wintergreen. So hopefully what they have planned next, what they have in mind, is more structured and consistent, because that's all this series really needs. It needs a goal, it needs a solid vision, which the first season did not have. So fingers crossed. I enjoyed this episode. I think it was probably the best episode of Season 1, if you think of it that way. And if not, then at the very least, it sets everything in motion for the possibility of a better Season 2. So 1 thumb up, 1 thumb middle. And now we can head on into listener questions. Our first question comes from the amazing Akicat on Twitter. And her question is, what book had the most impact on my life? And I think I've answered this question before, but it's such a great book that it bears repeating. And that book would have to be Brooklyn's Dreams from J.M. DeMatteis and Glenn Barr. It is honestly one of my favorite books of all time, one of my favorite comics of all time, one of my favorite stories of all time. It is just one of those series that just struck such a chord with me, and it still hits that same tune with me to this day. I read it when I first started reading comics, like around 11 or 12, and I have no doubt that I read it too early, and every year it's a story that I find myself thinking back on and realizing more and more about it, uncovering another layer of how much it influenced me and how much it really meant to me and how much I learned from it and how much guidance I took from it, or the advice and morals it imparted. And the story is pretty simple. It's honestly just a middle-aged man going over his period of teenage angst, going over obsessing, discussing, and analyzing his own whiny teenage complaints, and the character keeps trying to give it some grander, ever-encompassing importance, but he keeps failing at it because it's just so hard to really relate and impart what something meant to you to other people, and he realized that, so he just keeps getting lost in his own memories and his own fascinations about his childhood. And it's perfect. It's probably like one of the best stories ever written about teenage angst, because it is silly, it is ridiculous, it is petty, and it is so short-sighted, but it's purposely so, and that makes it so relatable and so honestly organic and natural and just beautiful. It really is. And it's something that I feel had more influence in my life and had more influence on how I see the world than I even thought of. Like throughout my childhood, I remember vividly specific parts of that comic. And honestly, now thinking back on it, I can understand exactly why. So honestly, I don't think any other book compares. And if you haven't read it, I definitely recommend it. It is a wonderful experience if you can get right into it. Like I said, it might not be for everybody. Anyway, thank you for that question, Aki Cat. It was really fun to go back to that. I love talking about this book. I love recommending it. It's just so important to me. So thank you for that question. I had such a great time answering it. And I want to give a grateful shout out to everyone out there who's ever sent in a question, comment, or topic to the show. It means so much to me and I have such a great time. So thank you so much. And if anyone out there has their own question, topic, or comment they want to discuss on the show, you can always find me on Twitter at THE_SNICKMAN. And I want to give a shout out to the cover artists for the show at DOTEMCEE. Check them out. They are amazing. So please give them some traffic. And that is it for this week. I just want to say thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great one. So see you next time.